So yes, I'm very happy to very warmly welcome Professor Bergmann, and we're all waiting very much to hear her paper. Thank you.
So thank you very much all for the invitation. The title, Diocletian's Porphyry Workshop, New Images of the Roman Emperors and the Role of Local Craftsmen in their conception, suggests a special production of imperial portraits, sarcophagi, and related objects made from the purple hard stone quarried on Mons Porphyrites in Egypt's eastern desert, in a period of the decisive reorganization of the Roman Empire. This group of sculptures became the clearest expression of a new late antique interpretation of Roman emperors concerning ideology and regalia, but at the same time, they were executed in a style that was very expressive, but also much indebted to local craftsmanship. This is a rather special and singular case of contact between the Roman world and local traditions in Egypt, and thus I hope it fits into the basic theme of Graeco-Aegyptiaca. To begin with, do you all see the screen without anything written above? Do you see the full screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay. To begin with, let me remind you of some central facts of Diocletian's reign. In the second half of the 3rd century, simultaneous attacks on all borders of the Roman Empire and internal upheavals with short-lived reigns of emperors led to a general crisis, if you allow me to use the disputed term. When Diocletian was made emperor in 284, he decided that the administration and defense of the empire needed more than one experienced emperor, and first elected a co-emperor, Maximianus Herculius, titled Augustus like himself, and in 293 enlarged the group with 2 slightly younger colleagues who were each assigned to one of the elder emperors, thus forming a tetrarchy with 2 elder Augusti and 2 younger Caesares. Diocletian as Maximus Augustus still had a leading role.
A wide variety of different
All of them were born in so-called Illyricum, the region comprising present Croatia and Serbia, and had been shaped by their experience in the elite Illyrian troops. They were responsible for the administration and defense of different parts of the empire, and with their roles came a number of new imperial residences from York and Trier in the west to Antioch and later Alexandria in the east, and that is polycentrism. On the map, the residences are indicated by round points. Thus, Rome lost much of its importance as a center of the empire. The tetrarchs managed to defeat attackers and usurpers on all fronts. At the same time, Diocletian, one of the few Roman emperors capable of developing comprehensive political concepts, reformed the empire, the administration, and thus the structure of province divisions, the military, taxation, the monetary system, and he even tried to decree maximum prices of all commodities. Acknowledging a long-term development, he abolished the fiction introduced by Augustus that Roman emperors were not monarchs, but co-regents with the Roman Senate, and equipped the ruler with the external trappings of a monarchy, such as titles, regalia, ceremonial. After decades of usurpation, the joint reign of several emperors was a risk, and accordingly, the concordia of the rulers was incessantly invoked. But it, the joint reign, functioned for 20 years and survived a change of protagonists by a famous act. In 305, Diocletian and Maximian retired, their Caesares were advanced to Augusti and chose new Caesares. But without Diocletian, and as was to be expected, rivalries grew very soon, and in 324, Constantine became sole ruler. Central elements of monarchical regalia, paradigmatically known from the Persian kings, were purple and jewels. And this led to the use of purple vestments and shoes adorned with jewels by the emperors, and of purple stone for the representation of the emperors and objects surrounding them. Before turning to the issue of the workshop, a look at the famous groups of the 4 emperors which adorned pairs of columns may show how the porphyry products reflected the tetrarchic innovations in regalia and ideology. The groups consist of 2 pairs of emperors. In the Vatican, 2 older and rather grim Augusti and 2 younger and friendlier Caesares are recognizable, each united in a gesture of embrace, which denotes similar rank and the much invoked Concordia. These groups with slightly individualized faces surely represent the emperors of the first tetrarchy. Their cuirasses and laurel wreaths are still mostly conventional, except some jewels adorning the lower border of the cuirasses. The globes characterize each of them as a world ruler. Whereas the use of purple stone in generally denoted monarchy, purple used for the flesh of faces and hands was new and characterized the emperors as entirely purple through and through. Sometime later, as we see in a group now in Venice, and related fragments, the iconography was basically the same, but the message was enhanced and differentiated. The jewels on belts, swords, and shoes were part of the proverbial attire of monarchs, whereas the caps made from felt or leather and only worn by these emperors and soldiers later, were the pileus pannonicus, the typical headgear of the Illyrian Pannonian troops mentioned by the military writer Vegetius. Thus equipped, the tetrarchs evoked the loyalty of the Illyrian troops and the virtus exercitus Illyrici, which had been praised already in the middle of the 3rd century on coins. I think that the still rather conventionally adorned tetrarchs in the Vatican were made shortly after 293, and the Venice ones with their intensified messages and related fragments are decidedly later, but still before 305, still in the first tetrarchy. These pairs of columns were produced in different sizes, as we can see from fragments, and probably were incorporated into architecture that framed passages, as is the case today in the Vatican on the right, low, or rather apses. Of course, we need baldachin architecture, rather apses which usually terminated representational rooms in the tetrarchy and later. Framing a single living tetrarch or high official, the columns with the sculpted groups would have made it clear that those in office acted on behalf of all 4 rulers. These groups are a clear expression of the need to make the novelty and success of the tetrarchic experiment abundantly clear to the public. I turn now to the production of the porphyry objects themselves. The porphyry quarries are located in the Egyptian Eastern Desert, and its material was used since the 1st century, mainly, but not only, for decorative purposes like columns, basins, or posectile, which was wall and floor decoration made from cut colored marbles. The material used to be exported in the form of blocks or roughed out, mostly to Rome and finished there. The polycentrism of the tetrarchy, however, made it preferable to work out porphyry sculptures in Egypt itself and distribute them from there, unless major commissions made it necessary that sculptors accompanied the sketched out material and finished it on site, as for instance, a composition at Romuliana, a villa of Galerius in Serbia, with emperors crowned by victories floating in the air. The finishing of sculptures in Egypt is proven by comparatively numerous finds in the country, mostly in Alexandria. But the porphyry sculptures seem to have nothing to do with the Alexandrian marble works. See here the latest datable marble statue from the middle of the 3rd century. Rather, the uniquely abstract and simultaneously expressive, but also slightly primitive style of the porphyry works has always fascinated researchers. Scholars have posited that the style indicates that the times of unrestricted supremacy of the so-called classical tradition were now over. a line of thought that I will not pursue further, but have also asked what the style might say about Diocletian, to whose special area of responsibility Egypt belonged. In the choice of such a workshop, should one recognize the reflection of a modest taste, as one might infer from the statement of Aurelius Victor, citat, they, the tetrarchs, all had their home in Illyricum. Although they had little education, they were sufficiently acquainted with the miseries of the country and of military service, and did much for the state. Or should one, as Ernst Kitzinger argued in his book, Byzantine Art in the Making, 1977, but rather influential, should one see in this choice a provocative, politically motivated rejection of the old educational ideals and their representatives? Or was the peculiar style of the sculpture simply due to the fact that they were executed in the remote porphyry quarries? I tend to exclude the last explanation because the products of the porphyry mountain had to be transported by camels from the quarries at least 170 kilometers along a desert track to the Nile, and from there to Alexandria for further use. This makes it probable that the products were roughly sketched out, not finished, at Mons Porphyrites in order to reduce their weight. And because of the danger of breakage, they were worked out more fully in a separate workshop on the Nile or in Alexandria. However, an approach, though not a clear solution to the above-mentioned questions, is possible through results of research on Mons Porphyrites and the neighboring Mons Claudianus by Valerie Maxwell and David Peacock, and through observations on the sculptures themselves. Specialists in working hard stone were needed for the quarrying, sketching out, and finishing of the sculptures. These were probably not easy to find at the end of the 3rd century. In the early and middle imperial period, the above mentioned columns, monumental vessels, cladding, and floor slabs were produced in large quantities, not only on Mons Porphyrites, but in even greater quantities in the quarries of gray granite at neighboring Mons Claudianus and those of rose red granite at Aswan, and exported from there. On a smaller scale, sculptures in traditional Egyptian style were produced from the gray Wacke quarries also in the Eastern Desert. By the end of the 3rd century, however, only, it seems, the quarries of Aswan were still working really in the usual way, and they were located directly on the Nile. The quarries of Mons Claudianus were closed around 230. At Mons Porphyrites, the excavators could not find any proof of activity in the second half of the 3rd century, a particularly turbulent period in Egypt. The resumption of quarrying porphyry was limited to a part of the quarry under Diocletian, and worked through the 4th century, and everything was abandoned in the first half of the 5th century, as especially pottery has shown. Likewise, the traditional construction of Egyptian temples had sharply declined in the 3rd century. So sculptors who were not column specialists, but who could carve sculptures from hard stone, were therefore probably rare, and it will not have been easy to get rock quarrying a new production off the ground. However, Diocletian, who was not only the Maximus Augustus, but also had special responsibility for the area, was not deterred by this. The sculptures themselves reveal that both the design and execution were done by a staff trained in local rather than Alexandrian traditions. In the following, I shall give an impression of the technical iconographical imprint of Diocletian's porphyry experiment. I shall try to show that there was a very limited but carefully chosen range of products, and will describe the novel origins of certain unusual iconographies and stylistic elements of the new products, and the interrelationships between objects in terms of style and formulas. Since this portion of my talk requires a lot of detail, I begin with 3 pieces of general information. First, the most obvious argument for the existence of a single and not several porphyry workshops. Second, some key data on the period when the workshop was active. And third, a map showing the geographical distribution of its products. First, then, one of the arguments for the existence of a single workshop is the similarity of all their portrait heads, which vary from slightly individualized to completely unindividualized, but this seems not to depend on the workshops. They differ mainly in having graphically rendered hair and beards or not, and if not, the hair and beard were rendered through paint, as I've been able to demonstrate some years ago. Second, the recognizable duration of the workshop. The earliest, you saw the probably earliest, more or less datable examples, the ruler groups in the Vatican, which I already discussed. The latest datable examples showing peculiarities of the workshop are imperial chlamydati, that is figures who wear the long chlamys, of the second half of the 4th century, for which, as I have shown elsewhere, the workshop was prescribed new models and the pictorial language of Aphrodisias in Constantinople. Here you see the famous Oikoumenios at Aphrodisias, dated by the portrait to 400, and the closely related to porphyry figures, one in Ravenna. You will see some evidence for this workshop continuity later. After the closing of the porphyry quarries in the 5th century, it was, however, still possible to fall back on existing supplies, especially those in Rome. Then here is a distribution map which shows that porphyry objects were exported as far as Rome, but not farther to the west until now. Porphyry, yes, but nothing from this workshop, and no sculpture. They were exported as far as Rome and had centers in the east, including not only the big cities, but also fortified villas of the tetrarchs. And now the dark yellow part, like Diocletian's retirement palace at Spalato in present-day Croatia, but especially in Serbia. Romuliana, the just already mentioned fortified villa belonging to Galerius, nearby Sharkamen, possibly a villa of Maximinus Daza, 305 to 13, and the villa of Mediana near Naissus, where Constantine was born. We will return to Mediana later. And now to the objects genres. Let us look again at the groups of tetrarchs on the columns, now, however, under the aspect of the figure style. The expressive disproportion of heads and hands, which are too big in comparison to the bodies, are found in Rome too, on the left. The squat proportions of the figures without a waist and the Egyptian combination of rather frontal bodies with legs in profile view and without contrapposto connect the figure type with popular representation of military gods of various origins from the Fayum and other places in Egypt, especially the left figure on the painted panel on the right. And these proportions are the peculiar body proportions probably go back to precursors of Hellenistic type, but we don't speak about that now. The figures in Venice are more slender, but have the waistless torsos, the rather frontal bodies with legs in profile, and again lack contrapposto. Their swords belong to a type that normally has hilts in the form of eagles' heads. But in this case, the hilts have the round heads and round eyes of falcons, the largest birds of prey in Egypt, and also incarnations of the king god Horus. Another new product of the workshop are colossal enthroned emperors, usually about 2.5 times life size, wearing the toga and sitting on jeweled thrones. Such jeweled thrones are otherwise attested only later on Constantine's coinage after 324. However, the dating of these huge figures to the Tetrarchic period is very probably by the fragments of sculpture from the fortified villa of Scharkamen on the right, which, as I mentioned, probably belonged to Galerius' nephew Maximinus Daza. The exact reconstruction of the fragments is still hypothetical. In the later Roman Empire, a seated emperor wearing a toga should probably be understood as representing the emperor as consul. The function of the statues is, however, not clear. The statue from Alexandria was found in the ancient city center, whereas the Scharkamen statue was found near the tumulus tombs of the emperor's family outside the fortified villa, smashed into 250 fragments. The format of these statues as an essential element of the series was as new as were the thrones. At the same time, the statue in Alexandria gives an impression of the difficulties with which the sculptors had to deal. Evidently, they had no model for making a sitting toga statue because they are rare, and had to devise this on their own. So they borrowed the schema for the tunica folds on the chest from the omnipresent statues of the god Serapis. The draping of the toga on the chest mixes two different types of draping, which cannot be reproduced in reality. It would be too time-consuming to explain this, which means the whole draping of the toga. So, but you can see the same kind of inconsistency on the lower part of the statue. A seated togaed figure normally slings the garment around his body in the same way as if he were standing, throwing the end over his left shoulder to the back. He can, however, as you see on the right figure, he can, however, lay the toga across his thighs and then fold it back so that its end hangs down, zigzagging between his legs. On the porphyry statue, the front part of we must call it toga, has two ends, one coming from somewhere above and zigzagging down between the legs, and the other coming from his right flank, crossing the thighs and hanging down beside his left leg, as on the statues of Serapis. And the two of them can't be combined. In a similar way, the shoes mix elements of the correct shoe for a member of the Senate, a closed shoe covering the ankles and going higher up on the leg, and of sandals. I don't show it. Serious flaws in the emperor's dress, which had indicated highest social status for centuries, are very remarkable. Apparently, neither the workshop nor its patrons were concerned with them. Standing togati were more easily available as examples for sculptors, and thus this standing porphyry togatus is quite correctly draped, but again, the Serapis schema was used for the breast of the tunica. The style of execution of the drapery of the fragment garments of both the standing and the seated togatus, however, is typical for the whole porphyry workshop. I call it Seilfaltenstil, which would be translated rope pleat style. The garment folds rest like ropes on plain surfaces. Garment sections are pushed together to appear as bundles of parallel ropes, and in complicated fabric movements, the folds hang together something like cobwebs. This design is undoubtedly, to some degree, or to quite an important degree, derived from late Egyptian hard stone sculpture on the left, whose design in turn continues much of that of ancient Egypt. In spite of all these different constraints and heterogeneous components, however, the products are rather impressive. A slightly Underlife-sized bust in the Vatican, whose head does not belong to it, is another example of the close relations among the workshop's production. Its network of rope-like folds links it strongly to the two togati, which you saw. Its back shows that it once adorned a column from which it was cut away. This column was once reused in the fountain in the forecourt of Old St. Peter in Rome. And the drawing on the left, made before 1608, shows that the bust rested once on a globus. The motive of its drapery was also a schema. It is repeated exactly on one of the miniature busts of deities which adorn the laurel wreath on the head of the Emperor Galerius, made shortly after 305 from his villa at Romuliana. And in about 350, parts of the schema are still used on the chlamys of an emperor from Egypt, now in Vienna. In this case, the workshop must have had some exotic model. No parallels for this schema outside of this workshop are known. A final figure type is comprised of busts clothed in the tunica and a paludament chlamys, which covers the entire upper body and is fastened with a new type of crossbow fibula. This attire indicates the beginning of the use of the paludamentum or chlamys as a status costume, which, as discussed only recently by the Aphrodisias excavators and others, was not adopted for full figure honorific statues until later in the 4th century. You see again the famous Oikoumenios at Aphrodisias, dressed like this. Marble busts draped in this way exist before the Tetrarchy, but they are very rare. Here are examples from Atribis in the middle, in the southern Nile Delta, the capital of one of the new provinces of Diocletian. Then a new find on the left from the residence at Sirmium in present-day Serbia, which is one of a pair and a part of a whole complex of porphyry sculptures. It demonstrates that the globe also belonged to these busts. A small arch at the lower edge of the bust of Atribis indicates that a separately worked globe was placed here too. On the right in the picture is a roughly sketched bust of the type still, hopefully, in the quarries at Mons Porphyrites. The bust on the globe was an old motif used for emperors, but only in highly exceptional cases it was used for marble busts, such as the famous bust of Commodus in Rome. Possibly the importance of the globe symbolism in the Tetrarchic period, in combination with the frequent use of this motif for Serapis. You have some very special exemplars on the right. One is a bust of Serapis on an eagle, and the eagle is on a globe, and the head was worked in better material and then how do you say attached to the thing. And the other is a lamp from Shadia near Alexandria. So I think that it's possible that the fact that that was used so very often for Serapis too, both together may have contributed to making these busts with a technically rather difficult application of this the globus below the bust. The peculiar zigzag folds of the paludamentum chlamys of the porphyry busts return as a formula still on the neck of the chlamydatus from Ravenna in the time of around 400 AD. So you see how long these formulas stayed with the workshop. Then there are the imperial sarcophagi in Rome, Istanbul, and Alexandria. They do not adopt the sarcophagus type with a pedimented lid of 2nd century Alexandria, which was a standard type and was used again for the imperial porphyry sarcophagi from the later 4th century onwards. However, the tetrarchic Constantinian type of porphyry sarcophagi is unique in that it follows the typology of, it seems, the typology of Egyptian late period sarcophagi, except that the latter are usually rounded on one side. A survival from the Hellenistic period, which is also typical for Roman Egypt, that a lot of things from the Hellenistic period survive. The survival from the Hellenistic period was a form of the laurel, which occurs everywhere among the workshop's products, on Galerius' wreaths at Romuliana, on the garlands of sarcophagus lids in Alexandria and Rome, on basins and altars, and on the wreaths of the monumental column monument of Constantine in Istanbul, which was consecrated in 328. The laurel consists of small, rigid, pointed leaves with a convex midrib. They correspond to the early Hellenistic laurel type seen, for example, at the Temple of Demeter at Pergamon from the mid-3rd century BCE. This form was supplanted in the 1st century BCE by more luxuriant and more decorative forms, especially in Asia Minor, which were also common on Roman imperial wreaths, as you see with Marc Aurel. In Egypt, however, the old laurel type survived in faience pottery, above right, and in wooden friezes, although I have not seen it in marble work. And finally, some thumbs and a back pillar. We all know the habit of Egyptian imagery of depicting objects and figures as completely as possible and in their entirety, such as head, legs, and feet in profile, while the chest is rendered frontally, and overlaps are avoided. In the case of hands holding objects, this manner always leads to the thumb not participating in grasping, but lying straight, outstretched above the grasping fist, as on the lower left. On the upper left, the hand is shown from the back, but the thumb is still stretched out in front. Compare also the hands with the protruding thumbs in this relief in Karnak, especially on the shoulder. These forms of representation can be observed on Egyptian type images from the 4th millennium BCE to the last examples in the 4th century CE. But I was very surprised when I noticed in the photo of the tetrarchs at Venice on the left bar, that the tip of the thumb of the hand holding the sword had been cut off. And this can only be the case if it protruded visibly in front of the hand. On the plaster casts of the group in Göttingen, I then saw that the tips of all other thumbs of the Venetian tetrarchs protruded in the same way and were probably deliberately chipped off at some point. There are several other examples of these Egyptian thumbs on porphyry sculptures, a particularly impressive imprint of old local traditions on the sculptors. And finally, these two statuettes of Asclepios and Hygieia were found in a statuary depot of the Constantinian villa of Mediana near Naissus. Their inscriptions indicate that they were once private dedications, and the style of their garments shows clearly that they are products of the workshop. The enormous back pillar of Asclepios, I mean the figures are about 45 centimeters high. The enormous back pillar of Asclepios, completely superfluous for the statics of the figure, is as strangely traditional as the peculiar rendering of the thumbs. To sum up, after the establishment of the full tetrarchy at the latest, Diocletian reactivated porphyry quarrying at Mons Porphyrites and established a workshop in Egypt specialized in working the hard stone for the desired representation of the monarchical character of the reign. And this required the purple stone in particular. The workshop was commissioned to produce new kinds of monuments that reflected the special conception of rule of the tetrarchs more directly than was the case with much of the more traditional marble sculpture. To a special degree, therefore, sculpting imperial commissions was now a matter of implementing imperial directives rather than producing honorific statues from the usual repertoire of the previous 300 years. However, this imperial requirement created a problem for the presumed hard stone workshops. As far as can be observed, they were given particular directives, but possessed no models or very few models to work from. Rather, it seems as if they were compelled to execute works based on oral or written instructions, or at most roughly sketched models, the specific design of which was left to the workshop leaders, who resorted to very different models and formulas, most of which, however, corresponded to a rather popular level of iconography and workmanship, which does not mean that they did not produce very impressive and expressive works. The old question as to whether these sculptures attest to the simple taste of the tetrarchs, which correspond to their simple origins, or whether conversely Diocletian consciously opposed the classical forms and taste of the, to put it simply, marble tradition, and other views, are not rendered superfluous by these observations. Instead, the observations presented here reveal that another component stood before such judgments. That's the pragmatism that motivated and shaped the new production. And let's say not only the pragmatism and the idea that these things have to be done, however. To find out more about the background of the workshop, one must study more of the hard stone sculpture of Roman Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bergmann. That was a fascinating lecture, and I feel I've learned so much about this material, and it's also fascinating to see the way in which these very ancient Egyptian iconographical elements get as it were pulled into a completely new kind of image. I mean, it's a fascinating example of image making rather than tradition following. I think people will have lots of questions and observations to make about what Professor Bergmann has said. I'm asking if people want to, they can write questions in the chat, or else we'd prefer it if you would speak up so that everyone can hear you. It's better for dialogue that way. But it's your choice. So yes, I'm opening the floor for discussion.
Shall I close the?
Or else you can keep it open if you think that we could use the pictures later on. I don't know. Yeah. We have a question from Arpad. Yes, he asks, were there other porphyry quarries in the territory of the Roman Empire, and can we distinguish also some other late antique workshops?
No, of course, that's the thing that the rain porphyry. I mean, there are. If you go through Europe, there are things which are similar, but nothing as nice as the Mons Porphyrites. And so it was as everywhere in the Roman Empire, they used special qualities at a high level. And so they used Mons Porphyrites for the red porphyry. And what late antique quarries, yes, but yeah, we know that very well. And of course, Göktepe in Turkey is one of the very recently explored quarries, and then there are 3 famous quarries in Asia Minor and so on. So that is all. That is all rather clear. Or I mean, very much of these, of course, quarries is not clear, but there are some very prominent examples.
So I assume just to continue from Arpad's question, I assume that the image you showed us of a statue that was roughed out and left at the quarry site implies that that all the work was done at the quarry site, or would they have roughed out the stone and then moved it to another? Would the workshop have been in a different place?
Yeah, I mean, one must say that that's the normal thing to do, that they rough it out because of the weight. And then, I mean, they had to do it. Specialists have argumented that you couldn't even use walls to pull. Let's say they have 20-meter columns coming from Mons Claudianus, and they couldn't even use bulls because they need so much water and so much food. So they had to bring it on with camels, pull the things with camels. So, and of course, the normal thing would be to rough it out and then to work it somewhere else. And of course, I always, this is many years ago, I also thought, maybe they did it somewhere in the country, but why do it in the country when you have to go to the Nile anyway and bring it down to Alexandria to send it somewhere also? And then one has to ask what happened to the workshops in Alexandria. But after the Palmyrines, I mean, with all these wars all around, and then the Palmyrines were for some time the owners of Egypt, and probably, perhaps there were very few people who they had gone to other projects of Diocletian, where they built and built and built, and so. But that would be the normal thing to do.
Thank you. We have a question from Elizabeth Bartman. She writes, I believe Delbruck argued that the final polishing was achieved with diamonds from India. Do you agree?
I don't know anything. Does Delbruck say it? I never read it. And
Elizabeth, would you comment?
You know, I don't remember this. If you can believe it, some 30, 40 years ago, I was asked this question on my PhD orals exam by Richard Brilliant. And I don't know if I had read it or they had read, I can't really remember, but I was just curious as you about how you thought this extraordinary polish was achieved on this very, very hard stone.
I must say the polish, but probably you know that, but we should say it. The polish you see in Rome, for example, or let's say in Rome, it's not the ancient polish. It's Baroque polish. This really like this very, very strong. Very, very strong polish is mostly Baroque, and And the ancient polish is much less shiny, let's say, which is much more beautiful, I think, when it's not so shiny. And in Rome, there were some years ago still workshops who worked a bit with porphyry. And they said it's not so difficult to cut it. I mean, it's a bit exaggerated normally when one thinks it's so difficult, it's so hard. I mean, it's hard. It's harder and normal, as is the habit of ancient sculptors. They work with certain materials and with others not. That's clear, but it's not so extremely hard. Would be less hard when it's fresh, but
Thank you. Thank you both. Do we have any more questions or observations?
I mean, if I may say, add something. I always, in all these late histories of late antique art, and so there might come up the question, or formally, yeah, what about development and how does it relate to later sculpture and so on? But if one looks at it as an experiment, then this experiment is typical, of course, that they did it in this way. That may be typical for the period, but all the same, it was an experiment, and one doesn't want, and one can see very, very nicely how the workshop got new models and a new, let's say, pictorial language in the second half of the 4th century. So I mean, one can really follow up how things developed in a certain way.
We have a question from someone identified only as Lenovo. Do we know perhaps something about what kind of jewels or stones were on the front side of the thrones?
Of course not, but I mean, one doesn't know exactly, but it is known that it is known from the, I think, Codex Theodosianus, who was allowed to have wedge jewels. And so, as far as I remember, and the emperors were, only the emperors were allowed smaragd and rubin. So I imagine red and green, gold, the thrones also. Yeah, that would be like that. We also have tried to make reconstructions on paper, but it looks so much kitsch that it's difficult to avoid. So we gave it up again.
We have a question from Brian Martins, who asks, what were the largest dimensions of these statues?
Yeah. The largest dimension, which I know, are the sitting togati, and so they, Delbrück has, says they are they are really big, and they are 2.5 times life size. So, but is the reason for the question the problem of that porphyry doesn't exist in very big, you can't make very, very big objects from red porphyry, because the layers are not like that. It's not like gray granite, and not like Aswan granite. So you can't make columns which are, or let's say one has never seen columns which are longer than 8 meters. And so, was that the reason for the question?
Ryan, would you like to comment? Okay, he responds, thank you, yes, I think that was the reason then. Are they also in full depth or are they quite narrow, he asks?
What?
Are they, he asks, are the statues in full depth or are they narrow?
I mean, no, they are, on principle, they are in full depth. That's the sitting statues are really in full depth, but slightly flat on the back, as everything which is Roman imperial times. But the interesting thing is what Arne Effenberger, who was formerly the director of the Byzantine Museum in Berlin, he found out that the tetrarchs in Venice, which are now have a little bit of the column on their back, and they must have belonged to columns which were 8 meters high, or if a bit more, but they took them out to make plaster casts recently. And then people were able to look at the back and so on. And I find it very convincing that they were inserted in the columns, that from the beginning they were inserted into columns, because they are cut like that. And this makes sense. I mean, if you imagine the tetrarchs in the Vatican, you lose a lot of material if you make it in one. I mean, if you make it in one piece, the column and the groups, then you lose a lot of material around it. So if you make, and the Venice ones are much bigger than larger than the ones in the Vatican, and there they made them separately and inserted them. So that's for the question of the material and how the layers are in the quarries.
Thank you. Yes, well, while people think of other questions, I just wondered. I mean, I suppose because there's only one quarry that you can mine this stone from, it's recognized. I mean, when you look at a statue like the Venice Tetrarchs in a place like Constantinople, you would instantly recognize it as Egyptian in some respects, I suppose. And I wondered whether the material or possibly also I mean, you made these very interesting points about these Egyptian traits in the iconography emerging as a kind of response to a technical problem, an iconographic problem that the sculptors had to resolve, but which they did it in the only way they could. But would people in say a Greco-Roman context in the late imperial world have seen some kind of Egyptian or even pharaonic aspect to these sculptures?
Perhaps some people who know about sums, they would have perhaps realized, but I don't think so. It is just, I think they would have thought them provincial. Yeah. But I mean, of course, material was surely much more important. Art is a very difficult thing, so I think that yeah. And look, if you think of, for example, if you have, surely you have seen sometime the frieze in the mausoleum of Diocletian in Split, which is really, I mean, it's high up, okay, on the wall, but it's very, very, very simple. And so it just has to be there. And it was, yeah, I mean, the question, yeah, you are quite right, the question, how exactly to look at the phenomenon still remains. But I wanted to make the point, before we speak about taste and things like that, let's first say, so a first step and see what happens.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Helen?
Were these statues made for the Greco-Roman because of the way they're dressed? Did the Egyptians dress like that too at this time period?
I mean, at that period, there were no more, I think there were no more Egyptians. I mean, I exaggerate, but probably we all know the, let's say, something about the development of Roman Egypt and about mixing and of cultures and so on. And you have to, a lot of people has two names already in the 1st century and so on. So I mean, real Egyptians as pure Egyptians probably didn't exist anymore, and defining pure Egyptians is perhaps also not the best idea, I think. If that answers, I don't know if that answers your question.
Huh? Okay, well, I think we can take that as having been an answer then. We have a further question from Jonathan Coulston, and I'll just read it out to you. Thank you for a very practical paper. Are the pre-Tetrarchic purple porphyry statues related in terms of style, drapery, etc., to Egyptian antecedents, or are they much more mainstream Greco-Roman style? Thinking of the seated togas from Caesarea Maritima and the porphyry dashins from Trajan's Forum, Firenze, Giardini Boboli, etc.
Yeah, that's
Certain people want a response.
What? Excuse me?
Surprising that, isn't it?
Who wants a response for what? Shall I answer this question?
No. Please answer this question. Yes. I think it was just somebody intervening. I don't know quite what was going on. But yes.
Yeah, that's of course a good question. Cesare, I think no, I don't. I think it is like this. It depends on where they were made, and most of the porphyry statues made before, I mean, they were only the bodies and not the heads clear. Also they had white marble heads, but that's not, I mean, that's just that's not what you asked. And the things in Rome were made in Rome. So that's at that time, before the Tetrarchs, mostly they imported either big, for the terme, big basins and so roughed out and then finished in Rome. And I think also the darker statues were absolutely made in Rome. Everything I know in Rome, I think, was made in Rome. And one can also, there's also a slide proof, for example, there is a very big and beautiful basin in Naples in the museum. And this is with complicated ornamentation. And it's there they use the drill, and none of the Tetrarchic and later things use the drill on porphyry. So I mean that's I think that is typical. And Caesarea things, I think they, of course, one would expect, but they look completely Roman. And either they were, I don't know where they were made. We could also say, okay, then they had some special sculptors at that time in Alexandria, but we don't know that, I would say.
Thank you. Well, do we have any more questions?
In the chat, do I see something?
I don't see anything new in the chat about Jonathan Couston. Thank you. Thank you for your answer. No? Well, then I think we'll thank you very much, Professor Bergmann, for your marvelous paper and for your responses. I think it was a very exciting discussion, and yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving us your time and your insights on this fascinating material. I really enjoyed it, and I think everyone else did too.
Thank you very much. And
thank you.
For another time, let's say personally, and
I hope so. I hope so. Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.